The origin of Sparta, the origin of Athens, and then the Greek and Persian War, and Peloponnesian War. So we're going to do real quickly. A lot of this you've read, we've gone over in philosophy or in your vocab. So I'm trying to catch up on a few things you might want a few notes on. Okay, so when the Mycenaean civilization dies out, they go into what they call the Dark Ages. This is like between 1150 or 1100 or so and 800 BCE. You notice everything changes, the arts, everything else. There's very little design on their pottery. There's very few finds of good jewelry or furs. Most of the information we have of the times actually come from the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they're actually even written later because they were oral stories for a long time. Should I stop talking? The political pattern is very simple during this time period. The villages are independent of each other. Rulers are called basileus, which is Greek for king, but there's really more of a tribal leader. Assemblies were informal, and they had to decide, and they were mostly just to decide where are we going to go fight our next battle, who we're going to, challenge for something. And there were really non-existent formal legal institutions. Justice was kind of family revenge. The government didn't think it was significant. So government really didn't seem important. You can kind of get that idea when you think about it. Odysseus was gone for 20 years, and they never really found a need to replace him. So it kind of shows you the role of the rulers during the end of the Mycenaean age time period. The religion is polytheistic, anthropomorphic, explaining the physical world. How to get benefits of a plentiful harvest, or how you have good health, etc. Different deities ruled over different functions and towns, as you've seen already. They pleased their gods with offerings and sacrifices. There was no real expectation of a wonderful afterlife. It was sort of indifferent into this murky world of maybe there was something or not. The life was worth living for its own sake, not for anything else, and for your own glory. You weren't expecting anything to happen afterwards. And they did find that part of that glory came from practicing some of the virtues that they really thought were important, such as bravery and wisdom and being cunning. That was actually a virtue that was very honored at the time. Being a service to your family and your community. They had great confidence that humans were great. Around 800 BCE, the villages started to get into larger units again. The towns were built on hills, often with a fortified marketplace down below. The marketplace was called the agora, or the big kind of an open area. And as time went on, they began to get permanent residents within the city area instead of the farming villages. And so that's how the cities started to be able to form. They weren't pre-planned. They were sort of built around this fortified center of the city. So thus began the polis, usually a single city with surrounding territory. The main ones were Sparta, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Miletus. Remember, Miletus is actually in Asia. It's on the other side of the Aegean Sea. They varied in size and population. Sparta was about 3,000 square miles, probably the largest, and it had around 300 to 350,000 people in its prime. Athens was about a third the size in land. It was about a little over 1,000 square miles, and it had about the same population. All the others were much smaller. both in size and population. Behind the rise of the polis, there were really two interrelated developments happening kind of worldwide. First of all, there was a revival of the trade with Western Asia. They used Cyprus, the island of Cyprus and the coast of Syria to access the riches from the Mesopotamian area, so the civilizations that were there, and the learning of new skills. So they added metalcraft. Remember, bronze is out, iron is in. The writing was different from earlier. They used the Phoenician system, which was sound syllable based, and they added symbols for the vowels. Literacy became widespread, and spurred economy, estate management, and the population grew. Sort of three different things under writing. Okay, they changed the system to Phoenician. Literacy became widespread, and that spurred the economy and estate management. This all led to migration and colonization. So now they get the first commercial warehouses, the marketplaces in overseas colonies for the benefit of the homeland, you know, Miletus and all those other colonies we saw. And the colonization peaked around 600, 650 BCE and centered in southern Italy and Ionia. So on the Turkey and Italy, that was the main center, but they colonized all those regions we saw in the map that we looked at before. Yeah?
You said that this was the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, but then you said it's 600, 650 BC. So is it all this good stuff, is this after the
We started with the collapse, and then we started, then we went to, after 800, we started the rise of the polis.
Okay, so after the rise of the polis, okay.
Yeah, so now we go to the rise of the polis after 800. Okay? Now, Sparta. Sparta is really interesting. The Spartans were descendants of the Dorian invaders that came in during the Dark Ages, so they were from the north. They based their economy on agriculture originally. They invaded neighboring city-states, which, you know, on the Peloponnese Peninsula, which is where Sparta is, the Peloponnese Peninsula, they actually have a really nice growing area. It's on the other side of the mountains, but it's a large, probably one of the largest plains around. People were growing and farming there. They went and took all those little city-states, they captured them, and they enslaved the local people, and they called them, who were called helots. Okay? And they forced them to farm their estates. They also enslaved a group of free individuals called the Parisi, who were artisans and merchants from those conquered lands. The Spartans did not feel it was worth their time and effort to participate in being traders, merchants, artisans, or agriculturalists, so they kind of left that to those people that they enslaved. But the ratio of these groups were there was about 200,000 of these enslaved people to about 10,000 Spartans. So now you can see a problem. If 10,000 people are enslaving 200,000, you've got to now focus on your military. And that's exactly what they did. They had to figure out a way that the entire society revolved around the army. So, there was a revolt in about 650 BCE, and it took 30 years for them to regain control. And then that's when they really decided that to maintain any legitimacy and power over those people, that military society had to really get strong. So, men wanted to be soldiers. Women wanted to be mothers of great soldiers. Okay? They despised the walled-in cities that everybody else had, and since they kind of had an open area that was kind of naturally protected from the seas, from the water, and then you had the mountains, and then you had the plains, they really didn't need it. It was sort of like in this valley. They didn't have any walls. And their kind of one of their mottos was, "A city defended by Spartans does not need walls." Okay? Babies were born, they were examined. If they were sick, weak, small, or anything else, they were left on the hillside or thrown off the cliff to die. They wanted strong, healthy children. So if anything born unhealthy or looked like it wouldn't be strong was just left to die. Up until 7, boys and girls were treated almost identically. One of the few civilizations in early times that gave the same amount of food to boy children and female children. most other civilizations, boys would eat more than the girls. If there was any problems, girls would, would be starved and the boys wouldn't. And here, the boys and girls were given equal amount of food and all that. At 7 years old, and they kind of had the same physical training. The girls were supposed to be athletic. They were supposed to learn to read and do figures. But at 7, their education changed. The boys were taken to barracks and military barracks to live there. Very, the time Spartan. This is where it gets. Spartan means austerity. It means that you live with very little and in fairly harsh conditions. So the boys were living in those conditions. Their education was reading, writing, military, and physical fitness, the endurance to pain. They would have to, if they did something wrong, they'd be whipped. If they were whimpered, they would get whipped more. So they learned to totally ignore any physical pain that they had. Women also need to be healthy and strong. They were trained in the gymnasium. They had a lot of freedom, more freedom than most other people. They were females. They were allowed to do shopping. They could attend dinners where non-family members were present. They owned property in their own names. They expressed their opinions on political events. However, they were restricted from taking part in any government. The government was very unusual. There were 2 kings. One was simply for the army, the king of the army, and the other, and he had no real political power, just taking care of the army. The other one was for religious purposes and to run the assembly. Okay, so when I say he didn't have any, they did have political power in that if anything was going into the army, that's the person that took over. If everything was going fine and they weren't dealing with wars and other things and that, then this other person would just take over the everyday affairs. The assembly, all males over 20 and were allowed to take part. They passed the laws and made decisions. They elected 5 overseers yearly, and you only got to serve once and for a year. They could veto legislation. So there's a group of people that could veto. If the whole group voted on something, there was this group of 5 people. If they agreed, could veto it. And the council of elders were the men, 28 men over 60. They're the ones that proposed the laws. They were the Supreme Court, and they assisted that other group of 5 that were kind of the overseers. The consequences. They maintained control over the helots for 250 years. The price of doing this was there was a real suspicious nature for the ideas of change. They lagged behind other city-states in developing trade and manufacturing. They didn't have the wealth of other city-states. There were fewer intellectual achievements. They were less intellectual. They didn't believe in philosophy, science, medicine, and all that. And there was absolutely no arts. They lived very, very simply. All of their doors and their architecture were exactly the same. The kings and there was very little status difference. You didn't live in a bigger house, a different house, a more decorated house. Everything was the same. You got your power through your bravery, your ability to live a Spartan life, your acts in war, and again, females being the mothers of soldiers. The men lived in these barracks until they were 60. They could come home, they could get married at 30, and they could come home, to be at home for a little while and reproduce, and then they're back in the barracks. So the women were basically raising the children until they were 7. The men would visit occasionally, and then the boy children went and lived with men. Okay, Athens. The origins they were the descendant of the Mycenaeans. Even though the region of the Mycenaeans lived close to where Sparta was. They lived on the peninsula of Attica. Their polis was named after Athena, obviously Athens. In the 600s, like other city-states in Greece, it developed enough population to create demand on a government for political and economic reforms, particularly for small farmers, merchants, artisans, who are the backbone of the economy. So at this point, in the 600s, the government from Athens and Sparta has really diverged. Athens gradually expanded its definition of citizenship to include more people. Originally, it was only a man whose father and maternal grandfather had been citizens could be citizens. But at about 600, non-landowning citizens, non-landowning citizens couldn't even participate in the assembly. During the subsequent 100 years or so, by 507, all free men were citizens regardless of class or ownership, and the result of this was reduction in friction between the people, unification, philosophic and technological and artistic advancements. How did this happen? It happened through a series of what we call tyrants. The word tyrants at the time simply meant a ruler, kind of one with sole power at the time. We've taken tyrants now to be much more draconian, much more, and we'll talk about Draco was one of the tyrants. Okay, so that's where that word comes from. But tyrants has taken a more negative connotation than it was at the time. There were about 4 most important tyrants. One was Solon, S-O-L-O-N. And we said this started about 600. He took over in about 594. So his problems were that there was a lot of economic trouble. Merchants and farmers owed a lot of money to each other and to the state. So he released everybody from land debts. If you owed a land debt, you were freed from it. He released all debtors from slavery. So he wanted to get people out working. He wanted to get people out of debt. They placed limits on the amount that any one person could own. So he's taking power away from kind of the aristocracy. Again, when you're looking at legitimacy, look at who has the power. He urged farmers to grow cash crops, such as olives, nuts, and all that, to promote trade instead of trying to grow grain, and then to trade for grain from some of their colonies. He promoted industry, urging fathers to teach their sons trades, etc. His goal was to ease the tension between the aristocrats and the commoners, which he did in some ways, but the aristocrats were losing power, so it actually didn't do everything he wanted. He set up the two-house legislature. So you had the aristocrats, the Council of 400, drafted measures, and land-owning commoners, the assembly, could vote on the measures. So again, think of who gained, who lost. The common people gained, aristocracy kind of maintained, got a little bit on the assembly, lost a little bit on some other things. Pisistratus, P-E-I-S-I-S-T-R-A-T-U-S. P-E-I-S-I-S-T-R-A-T-U-S. Pisistratus took over about 50 years later. So now he divided the large landowning estates among non-landowning farmers. So people who were working now got some of the land. He extended citizenship to non-landowning men. He gave loans to the poor and put them to work, but with work projects like creating temples, etc. So then again, now he's creating work projects, trying to get the some equality in the economy. Cleisthenes, C-L-E-I-S-T-H-E-N-E-S. He comes at about 500, and he introduced laws that really established democracy with 3 goals: to break up the power of the aristocracy, to extend citizen guarantees to more people, and to restructure the government. So now all men belong to the assembly. All were considered equal before the law and guaranteed free speech. The assembly passed laws, and a Supreme Court was chosen from 10 generals each year. There was a council of 500 chosen by lottery. They ran the everyday business and government, etc. The jury could be from 201 to 1,001. And they established ostracism, which you read about in your book. Ostracism, if you did something they didn't like, if you were a leader, you were a general, they could vote to ostracize you by just throwing in a certain percentage of ostriches, and that meant you were exiled for 10 years. So that's how they got rid of their anger towards people, and also got rid of rulers they didn't like. All right, guys. Bring your Odyssey notes.
Yay!
Speak to the camera.
How do we do audio?
Not camera, video. The bell ring. Sorry.